This 1909 photograph of two sisters looks ordinary until you notice the tag on the younger girl's shoe. The image had rested in a municipal archive for more than 100 years. It was labeled as a typical immigrant family portrait from the Lower East Side. No one had paid attention to the children's feet. Not until Dr. Sarah Brennan did. Sarah had been the lead archivist for the New York City Department of Records for nearly 15 years. She focused on progressive-era photography, the kind of images reformers like Jacob Riis and Louis Hine used to show poverty and push for reform. She had studied thousands of photographs of tenement children, dirty faces, worn shoes, empty eyes. But this photograph felt different. She found it inside a box of uncatalogued material donated by the estate of a social worker named Margaret Hollings, who had died in 1958. The photographs had been stored in climate-controlled rooms since 2003, waiting to be reviewed. At first glance, the image seemed plain. Two girls, perhaps 7 and 10 years old, stood on a wooden stoop outside a brick tenement. The older girl wore a dark dress with a white collar that had been repaired many times. The younger wore lighter clothing, likely a hand-me-down that hung loosely on her small frame. Both girls stared straight into the camera with expressions that were not smiling or crying, just flat and tired. Their hands were clasped together. The older sister's hand rested firmly on the younger one's shoulder, protective, almost fierce. Sarah scanned the photograph at high resolution, as she always did with images that might matter. She zoomed in on their faces first, then their clothing, then the background details, the stoop, the window, the worn brickwork. Then she moved down to their shoes. The older girl wore lace-up boots that had clearly been re-soled. The younger girl's shoes were falling apart, the leather cracked and splitting, and there, tied to the lace of her right shoe with a thin wire, was a small metal tag. A number was stamped into it, 247. Sarah leaned back in her chair. She had seen identification tags before. Ellis Island inspectors sometimes pinned paper tags to coats. Hospitals used wristbands, but this was different. This tag was attached to a shoe. It was small, intentional, meant to stay in place. The number was clean and sharply stamped, done by a professional tool. This was not temporary. This suggested a system. She printed the image and walked to the window, holding it up to the daylight. The tag caught the light slightly in the photograph, reflecting the sun the same way it must have reflected the camera flash in 1909. Suddenly, the younger girl's expression felt different to Sarah. Not just tired, but resigned, as if she understood what the tag meant and had already accepted it. The older sister's grip now looked less protective and more desperate, like she was trying to hold on to something about to be taken away. This was not just a simple old photograph. Something here was very wrong. Sarah had joined the Department of Records right after graduate school, when digital archiving was still new, and most historical photographs were kept in filing cabinets and cardboard boxes. She built her career on careful attention to small details, noticing what other archivists skipped over. A shadow in the wrong place, a date that didn't match the clothing, a misspelled name that hinted at something hidden. She had helped identify unmarked graves, correct false records, and rebuild forgotten neighborhoods from scraps of evidence. But she had never encountered anything like this tag. She returned to the box of photographs from the Hollings estate. There were about 200 images, most showing tenement life on the Lower East Side between 1905 and 1915. Families crowded into single rooms, children working in garment factories, women carrying water up narrow stairs, standard progressive-era documentation. But mixed among those familiar scenes were about 30 photographs that felt different. All of them showed children, usually alone or in pairs, standing in doorways or on stoops, and in at least half of them, if you looked closely, There were tags, sometimes tied to shoes, sometimes pinned to coat collars, sometimes looped around wrists with string. Sarah spread the photographs across her desk and began taking notes. Every tag carried a number, none carried a name. The children ranged from about 4 to 12 years old. Some looked frightened, some looked defiant, most looked empty. She picked up her phone and called the one person she knew who might understand what she was seeing. Dr. Michael Chen was a historian at Columbia University who specialized in child welfare systems in early 20th century New York. Sarah had worked with him on an orphanage project 3 years earlier and trusted both his knowledge and his discretion. When she described the photographs and the tags, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Can you send me the images?" he finally asked. His voice was careful, as if he did not want to jump to conclusions. She emailed him high-resolution scans of all 30 photographs with visible tags. He called her back within 2 hours. "I think you've found evidence of the placement system," he said. He explained that private relief agencies used tags when moving children between temporary homes. Officially, it was meant for record-keeping, to prevent children from being lost. But it also marked them, making sure everyone knew they were charity cases. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. How temporary were these homes? "That depends on what you mean by temporary," Michael said. On paper, placements were supposed to last weeks or months while families recovered. But in reality, many placements became permanent, and the terms were often unclear. Some families believed they were fostering children. Others believed they were receiving household help. Agencies were not always honest about what these arrangements meant. "What kind of agencies?" Sarah asked. "Mostly private charities," he said. The Children's Aid Society was the largest, but there were many smaller ones, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant groups. They competed for donors and funding, and they all followed different standards. Some truly wanted to help. Others were effectively running indenture systems. Sarah wrote down the names as he spoke. She asked about the metal tags, whether any records survived explaining the numbers. "That will be hard," he admitted. Many agencies kept poor records, and what they did keep was often destroyed later. But you might find something in municipal files or church records. Many placement decisions went through churches. And if Margaret Hollings was a social worker then, she may have left paperwork. Did the estate include anything besides photographs? Sarah checked the donation records again. The Hollings estate included 3 boxes. She had only opened the one with photographs. The other 2 were still in storage, labeled personal papers and correspondence. She signed them out immediately and carried them to her desk. The first box contained letters, dozens of them, bundled with old rubber bands that broke apart at her touch. The second box held ledgers, heavy books with marbled covers and lined pages filled with careful handwriting. Sarah opened the first ledger and began reading. It was dated from 1907 to 1911. Each page listed a child's first name, age, neighborhood, and placement date. Beside each entry was a number, matching the numbers stamped on the metal tags. Number 247 appeared on a page dated March 1909. The entry read, Rose, age 6, Orchard Street, placed with Dalton household, Brooklyn. Terms indefinite, mother signed consent. Sarah sat with the entry for a long time. Rose, the younger girl in the photograph, 6 years old in March 1909. Her mother signed consent, but consent to what? She kept reading. There were hundreds of entries, all following the same pattern. A first name, an age, a Lower East Side address, a placement with a family in Brooklyn, Queens, or the Bronx. The terms were almost always listed as indefinite. Nearly every entry ended with the same words. Mother signed consent. Sometimes father signed consent. Never both. Almost always just the mother. Sarah compared the addresses with city directories from 1909. Nearly all of the families lived in tenement buildings on streets like Orchard, Hester, Allen, and Rivington. These blocks were some of the poorest in Manhattan, where immigrants from Eastern Europe were packed into crowded apartments with no heat and no running water. These families were barely surviving, and someone had persuaded them to give up their children. She called Michael again and read several ledger entries out loud. He was silent for a moment, then said, "I need to see those ledgers myself. Can I come by tomorrow?" The next morning, Michael arrived with a colleague, a legal historian named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, who focused on contract law and immigrant rights. They spent 4 hours reviewing the Hollings papers together, comparing the ledgers with the photographs and with the limited records available in the city archives. What slowly became clear was a system that lived in the gray area between charity and abuse. Private relief agencies targeted immigrant families, especially Jewish and Italian families on the Lower East Side during times of crisis. A father's death, a mother's illness, a stretch of unemployment, a brutal winter. Representatives from these charities would visit and offer help: food, rent support, medical care. But the help came with strings attached. Families were often told they needed to send their children to live with better off families for a short time, just until things improved. The children would be fed, clothed, and sent to school. Parents were told they could visit. It was framed as kindness, a temporary solution to ease hardship. But the consent papers parents signed were not simple foster agreements. They were indenture contracts. These documents gave the agencies legal control over the children and allowed them to place the children in homes where they would work in exchange for food and shelter. The contracts were written in English, a language many parents could not read. The terms were unclear, the time frame was open-ended, and once a child was placed, it was nearly impossible for parents to get them back. This was legal, Patricia said, pointing to a sample contract tucked into one of the ledgers. Technically, it was all legal under New York law at the time. Indenture was still accepted, especially for children labeled as dependent or nearly dependent. The agencies took advantage of gaps in the law. They claimed they were saving children from poverty. In reality, they were supplying cheap labor to middle-class homes. What kind of work? Sarah asked. Mostly domestic labor. Girls washed dishes, did laundry, and cared for younger children. Boys ran errands, worked in yards, or helped with family businesses. Host families were supposed to provide food, shelter, and schooling. But there was almost no oversight. Agencies rarely followed up. The city did not inspect. The children had no legal protection. If they ran away, they could be arrested and sent to reform schools. If they complained, they could be moved to worse homes. Michael picked up the photograph of Rose and her sister. "The older girl isn't tagged," he said. "She was probably considered too old." Agencies focused on younger children because they were easier to control and easier to shape. But they also knew separating siblings caused distress, so they sometimes staged photos like this one, likely to reassure parents that family bonds were being respected. "But look at how they're holding each other," he added. They knew what was coming, and the photographer knew too. Sarah traced the outline of the older girl's hand on her sister's shoulder. "Do we know what happened to Rose?" Michael shook his head. "The ledgers stop in 1915. After that, nothing, but we can try to find the Dalton family." They spent the next 2 weeks searching. Patricia located the Dalton family in the 1910 census. James Dalton, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 biological children lived in a row house in Flatbush. 1 additional person was listed in the household. Rose, age 7, described as a servant. There was no last name, just Rose's servant. Sarah felt sick reading it. A 7-year-old labeled a servant, living with strangers, working for people who had no legal duty to protect her. Somewhere on the Lower East Side, Rose's mother and sister were living without her, possibly believing she was safe, possibly knowing the truth and being powerless to stop it. Michael later found a notice in a Brooklyn church bulletin from 1911. The Dalton family had donated money for a new stained glass window. The notice praised their generosity and described them as respected members of the parish. Rose was not mentioned. She existed only as a number in a ledger and a single word in a census. Patricia uncovered something else. In 1913, the New York Evening World published a series of articles about child labor in private homes. A reporter exposed how hundreds of immigrant children were working unpaid as domestics under the label of charitable foster care. The stories caused brief outrage. There were calls for reform. A commission was formed, but nothing meaningful changed. The agencies argued they were helping children who would otherwise starve or end up in orphanages. The city accepted that argument. The commission dissolved. The system carried on. Sarah now understood what the photograph truly represented. It was not just a picture of two sisters on a tenement stoop. It was evidence of a transaction. The metal tag on Rose's shoe showed she had been processed, numbered, and prepared for placement. The image may have been taken to show potential host families what she looked like. Or it may have been meant to calm her mother, even as Rose was being sent away to work. Either way, the image was not neutral. It was part of a system that treated poor children like property, exploited immigrant desperation, and wrapped indenture in the language of charity and reform. Sarah knew she could not leave the photograph untouched in the archive with its harmless description. But she also knew changing its interpretation would bring resistance. The Lower East Side was often celebrated as a story of struggle, followed by success. Museums preferred stories of resilience, not stories of children taken from families and forced into unpaid labor. She contacted the Tenement Museum, a respected institution dedicated to immigrant history. She sent the photos, the ledgers, and a summary of her findings to the Director of Collections, Dr. Ellen Vasquez. Ellen was known for pushing the museum to confront difficult truths. 3 days later, Ellen called. Her voice was tight. "This work is remarkable," she said, "and it's going to be controversial. You know that, right?" "I do," Sarah replied, "but we owe these children the truth." "I agree," Ellen said, "but we have to be careful." The museum depended on donors, many with family ties to the Lower East Side. Some might discover ancestors who took part in these systems. Accusations of exploitation would bring backlash. "I'm not accusing individuals," Sarah said. "I'm describing a system that existed and was accepted at the time. Many people believed they were doing good. That doesn't erase what happened to children like Rose." Ellen paused. "Let me take this to the board. I'll push for an exhibition, but I can't promise anything." 2 months later, Sarah sat in a conference room at the Tenement Museum with Ellen, Michael, Patricia, and 6 board members. The photographs were projected on a screen. The image of Rose and her sister filled the room. Sarah had marked the metal tag in red. The board studied the image in silence. Finally, one man spoke. His name was Robert Kessler, a major donor whose grandfather arrived from Poland in 1903. "I understand these systems had problems," he said carefully, "but I don't see why we need to call this exploitation. These charities were trying to help. Families were desperate. Sending children to homes where they would be fed seems reasonable." Patricia leaned forward. "With respect, that's the story the agencies told, but the reality was harsher. These children were not treated as family. They were treated as labor. They were being sent to houses where they would work. Contracts said this clearly, and the families who gave up their children often did not truly understand what they were agreeing to. Many of them could not read English. They were told their children would return home soon. They were not told that these placements could last for years or even become permanent. Another board member, a woman named Susan Greenberg, shook her head. "But how do we know that?" she asked. "How can we be sure what these mothers understood or did not understand? You are reading these documents in a very particular way. There could be other meanings. Maybe some families were thankful for the help. Maybe some children actually had better lives in the homes where they were placed." "That may be true," Michael replied. "But it doesn't change the core issue. Even if some children were treated well, the system itself was coercive. Parents were approached during moments of extreme crisis. They were pushed to give up their children with promises of short-term help. Then those children were used as workers. That is, indenture. It was legal, but it was still exploitation." The discussion went on for more than an hour. Some board members argued that the museum should highlight immigrant strength and survival, not focus on suffering. Others worried that an exhibition about child indenture would be too dark and would turn visitors away. One person suggested that if the topic was addressed, the museum should also emphasize the positive work some relief agencies had done to keep things balanced. Ellen finally stepped in. She said she understood everyone's concerns, but reminded the board of the museum's mission. Their job was to preserve and explain the history of urban immigrant life. That history included exploitation. It included systems that caused harm while claiming to help. If the museum only told comforting stories, then it was failing its responsibility. Sarah spoke next. She pointed out that these photographs had been displayed for decades with captions describing them as simple immigrant family portraits. The museum had shown them to the public without explaining what they truly represented. That was not neutral, she said. It was a decision to erase what happened to children like Rose. Continuing to do that meant being complicit in the erasure. The board voted. The decision was close, 4-3, but the exhibition was approved. It would open in 6 months, timed with a national conference on the history of child welfare. One gallery would focus on the placement system, using the photographs and ledgers from the Hollings estate as its main evidence. The museum also reached out to descendant communities to ask if anyone had family stories connected to child placement during that period. The response surprised them. Within weeks, more than 40 people replied. Some were descendants of children who had been placed. Others came from families who had taken children in. The stories were complex and often painful. Some described grandparents who had been separated from siblings forever. Others shared memories of children who were treated kindly and stayed in touch with host families as adults. A few respondents were angry. They objected to calling the system exploitative and insisted their relatives had been saved from poverty, not harmed. One message stood out. It came from an 83-year-old woman named Grace Steinberg in New Jersey. Her grandmother's name had been Rose. She had been placed in a Brooklyn household as a child and worked there until she was 16. Grace owned a photograph of her grandmother from around 1920, standing in front of a house in Flatbush. On the back, written in faint ink, were the words, "Rose finally free." Sarah and Ellen visited Grace at her home. Grace showed them the photograph and several other items, a worn copy of Rose's indenture contract, a letter from the relief agency telling the Dalton family that Rose was now old enough to leave, and a small metal tag stamped with the number 247. Rose had kept the tag all her life. When she died in 1987, she gave it to Grace with one instruction: remember what they did to us. Grace told them Rose's story. Rose was 6 when the agency came to her family's tenement. Her father had died in a factory accident. Her mother was ill and unable to work. An agent told Rose's mother that if she did not send her daughter away, the city would take both children and place them in an orphanage. The mother signed the papers because she believed she had no other choice. Rose was taken the next day. She was allowed to bring nothing except the clothes she wore. The Dalton family treated her as a servant. She woke before sunrise to light fires and make breakfast. She scrubbed floors, washed dishes, carried water, and cared for the Dalton children. She ate separately and slept in a small room near the kitchen. She could not leave the house without permission. She went to school only when the family did not need her work. When Rose turned 12, Mrs. Dalton taught her sewing. Rose spent evenings repairing clothes and making garments the family sold for extra money. Rose never saw that money. Her mother visited twice in the first year. Though visits were promised, the Daltons made them difficult, choosing inconvenient times and hovering during conversations. After the second visit, they complained that visits were disruptive. The agency agreed to stop them. Rose did not see her mother or sister again until she was 16. When her indenture ended in 1919, she was free to leave but had no savings, no job, and no idea where her family was. The Daltons offered to keep her on as a paid servant. Rose refused. She removed the metal tag she had worn for 10 years and walked away. She found work in a garment factory and later reunited with her sister, who was working as a seamstress. Their mother had died in 1917 during the influenza epidemic. The sisters had never been informed. Grace spoke calmly, but her hands trembled as she held the tag. She said her grandmother rarely talked about this until late in life. She felt shame not because of what she had done, but because of what had been done to her. She felt discarded. She felt abandoned, even though she knew her mother had no real choice. That feeling stayed with her for decades. Sarah asked if Grace would loan the tag and documents to the museum. Grace agreed at once. She said that was why her grandmother had kept them. She wanted people to know. She wanted the truth to be seen. The exhibition opened in October 2023. It was titled * numbered, Child Indenture in Progressive Era New York *. At its center was the photograph of Rose and her sister, displayed beside the indenture contract, the ledger entry, and the metal tag. Visitors could follow the path from an ordinary, looking photograph to the documents that revealed its true meaning. The exhibition included recorded testimonies from descendants, historical context, and explanations of the legal and economic systems that allowed child indenture to exist. The reaction was strong. Some visitors cried in front of the image. Others were angry, both at the past and at the museum for exposing it. Some donors withdrew support, saying the museum was damaging immigrant history by focusing on pain instead of success. Many others expressed gratitude. Teachers brought students. Social workers brought colleagues. Journalists wrote about the exhibition, connecting historical child indenture to modern issues like family separation and exploitative care systems. One newspaper review said the exhibition forced visitors to face how institutions praised as progressive were often systems of control. The photograph of Rose is painful not because of what it shows, but because of what it hides. The small metal tag on her shoe is a symbol of how poverty was punished and childhood was turned into a commodity in the name of charity. The exhibition ran for 8 months. During that time, the museum collected more than 100 additional family stories. Some confirmed the patterns Sarah and her colleagues identified. Others added complexity, showing how experiences varied within the same system. The museum is now planning a digital archive where descendants can contribute documents and stories. Sarah continues working with the Hollings papers. She has identified about 70 children in the photographs and is trying to trace their lives, to give them names instead of numbers. The work is slow. Many children left no records behind, but Sarah believes it matters. Every child who is named is one less person erased by a system that treated them as invisible. The photograph of Rose and her sister now hangs in the museum's permanent collection. The caption explains who Rose was, what happened to her, and what the metal tag meant. It is simple and factual, but for those who stop and really look, it changes everything. It turns an ordinary image of immigrant life into evidence of a system that took children and called it help. There are thousands of photographs like this in archives across the country. Children standing alone or together, wearing clothes that do not fit, staring into cameras with expressions we label as brave or stoic. We use these images to tell stories of struggle and progress, but we rarely look closely enough to see the tags, the numbers, the small signs of power and control. Rose's metal tag reminds us that photographs are never neutral. They are created by people with power and shown by institutions with agendas. The job of historians and archivists is not only to preserve images, but to question them, to ask what they hide, who benefited, and who was harmed. Rose kept her tag for 70 years. She passed it on with one instruction: remember what they did to us. Remembering is an act of resistance. It refuses comfort and demands truth. It asks us to look again at every old photograph and notice what we have been trained to overlook: the quiet evidence of systems hiding in plain sight.